range from champion footballers, past and present, to men and women of all ages from all walks of life. The common thread is their love of football, the bric-a-brac, the mementos, the trivia and the rarities. You will find them scouring junk shops at sporting fairs and in the rooms of Australia's most prestigious auction houses. In this show, we meet that burgeoning breed who are prepared to spend their hard-earned cash on a piece of memorabilia from years past. It might be a medallion, a footy jumper that has seen better days, or a scrap of paper with the name of a great champion inscribed forever. It may be displayed elegantly in pride of place, or quietly tucked away and put on display on special occasions. They're a rare group with a deep knowledge of football and its personalities. They are the collectors.
For some, it is a passion, the delight of amassing the memorabilia of an age past. In this show, we meet an intrepid bulldog, a man who's had a lifelong love for the navy blues of Carlton and its heroes past, and a man who caters to the whims of the public. Three men with a shared love on this edition of The Collectors. When you work for the local paper, have written a book about your heroes and are red, white and blue to the very core, it's little wonder that Footscray figures heavily in the collecting habits of Stephen Milne.
Hi, my name's Stephen Milne and I've got a passion for the Footscray Football Club. Have ever since I was a little fella, and sometimes it just drives my wife Louise crazy. I was fortunate enough a few years ago to write this football book talking about all the champs that pulled on the Guernsey for the Dogs over the years, Footscray's finest 50, Sons of the Scray. And I was fortunate enough to go out and interview the greats like Ted Whitten, Mr Football, John Schultz, Doug Hawkins, Jack Collins, and the list goes on. And we wrote this book, Mark Butler and I, a good mate of mine, Mark, who's now the police reporter at the Herald Sun, and we made a couple of dollars, but that wasn't the real reason we did it, and it's just a really great time in my life. After the book was published, Sons of the Scray, Mark and I went out to the top 10 players that we listed in our book and got them to sign a limited edition of 25, and you see there's some of the fascinating autographs. L.B. Morrison, Alan Banana Legs Hopkins, who unfortunately passed away last year, aged in his 90s. We've got the late and great Mr Football, Ted Whitten, Gary Dempsey, Doug Hawkins, Harry Hickey, who passed away a couple of years ago. So that was just a bit of a magic time to get all these great champs to sign the book, and they really are a collector's item. There's a few still kicking around, but that's just one of the real favourite items in my collection. The Bulldogs, well, they've only ever won one premiership back in '54. What a famous year that was, but they have produced some outstanding players, 9 Brownlow medalists, and as part of my collection, Kelvin Templeton there taking a great mark in front of Ross Glendenning, won the Brownlow medal in 1980. He was just a super player. Peter Box won the Brownlow in '56, and this was the front page of the Sun newspaper, and he was there with his wife and young child winning the Brownlow back in '56. Brad Hardy won it in '85, the Western Australian, and I've got the Brownlow medal menu, the year that Brad won it, and I've been lucky enough to get Brad to sign it just there at the top there. And Big Scotty Wine won it in 1992, the big ruckman Scotty Wine, and that was the annual report from the Footscray Football Club the year after he won it, so that's just an excellent little piece too. I wonder how many people have seen these. Back in the early '60s, famous soft drink manufacturer Coca-Cola brought out special bottle tops with the Stars of the Day on the inside. And I'm lucky enough to have the full set of the Footscray Football Club's Stars of the Day. And fortunately, one of the best conditioned bottle tops is the late and great Mr Football, Ted Whitten. It's always pretty difficult to find these bottle tops in pretty good nick. People often use the bottle opener to whack off the top, and obviously with the cork on the inside had to scrape it away with a knife. So often you'll find these in pretty bent and scraped condition. I'm pretty fortunate that my Bulldog team here is in very, very good nick. And there's some great names there. Johnny Gillard, who was named in the team of the century just recently on a half-back flank, and Bernie Lee was at half forward, so plenty of great names back in the early '60s for the Dogs. I'm pretty fortunate to have a famous collector as a father, Rick Milne, who might be well known out there. He gave me this for a Christmas present a couple of years ago. It's a terrific old sepia tone team photograph of the Footscray Football Club's VFA Premiership side way back in 1898. It was taken at the Thistle Studio and presented to William Dickens by the lady supporters of the club. It's a terrific old photograph. You have a look at a crazy arrangement of Guernseys. There's players with football boots without stops, and it's just a terrific walk back in time, back to 1898, which is many, many moons ago. And they were a powerhouse side, the Bulldogs, or the Tricolours as they were called back in those days, a powerhouse side in the VFA, and obviously were admitted to the VFL back in 1925, so 27 years before they were admitted to the big time. Footscray Football Club were admitted to the VFL in 1925 after their glorious years in the VFA, and Con McCarthy, the champion ruckman of the day, was their first captain, so obviously occupies a very special place in Bulldog history. And this is a postcard of the day featuring Con McCarthy. Staying on the postcards, here's another terrific colourful postcard featuring the Footscray Football Club back in the early 1900s, and it's to Susie. There's some writing on the back, to Susie from Myrtle at Upper Maffra back on the 25th of May 1907. It's a terrific piece, about a penny back in those days, and one of these cards sold at an auction recently for about $250, so just sensational stuff. The first game that I attended was a Footscray versus North Melbourne game at the Western Oval back 30-odd years ago. Mum and Dad barracked for the Kangaroos. You couldn't really go for the side that Mum and Dad were going for. And yeah, I went for the opposition, I went for the Bulldogs, and they have been a way of life for me ever since. Like I said a bit earlier on, I'm just a really passionate Bulldog supporter. My brother Peter, he went with Mum and Dad, he went with the Kangaroos, and he's got 4 premierships to show for it. I've got 30 years of heartache, but we're still hoping for our first premiership since the glory days of 1954. And just on 54, what a magical year. I've got some terrific memorabilia concerning Bulldogs' big year that year. Charlie Sutton, the captain coach. Jack Collins kicked 7 goals from full forward in the 1954 grand final win over Melbourne. And it's certainly a magic year as far as Footscray collectors are concerned. I'm fortunate enough to have this pennant, also the football record from the grand final and the annual report. And I've also got a terrific photo of Charlie Sutton bursting through the little banner that they made back in those days before the big game. Look, it is difficult collecting Footscray memorabilia. If you're a Hawthorn supporter, so many flags in the 80s. There's plenty of memorabilia out there. With the Bulldogs just having the 1 premiership in 54, obviously that year is a target for collectors. But with the Bulldogs, they've produced some magnificent players over the years. I just cannot believe they haven't had more success. Some of the greatest names of football, Mr. Football, Ted Whitten, Charlie Sutton, Norm Ware, they've produced 9 Brownlow medalists, so obviously I'm pretty keen on collecting memorabilia concerning the 9 Brownlow medalist careers, and so there's always something out there, but there are some hardcore Footscray collectors, Western Bulldogs these days, of course. A good mate of mine, Joe Boyer, who's featured on this program in recent months, well, he's absolute hardcore, and he's got a little bit more money than me, so he often knocks me off at the last minute. Have a look at this great old photo. They reckon it was taken in Mr. Football's lounge room at the day. We've got 3 players for the Vics from the Bulldogs, in Ray Baxter, Johnny Schultz, the Brownlow medalist, and the late and great Mr. Football, Ted Whitten, and my mate Hollywood Collins down the front. He was secretary at the time. This came from a house in Essex Street, a long-time supporter of the club, and it's just a great piece and great history at this club. At the time, most clubs just had 2 representatives with the big V, and the Bulldogs were lucky enough to have 3 this particular year. My old mate Doug Hawkins, what a great player. They've got a wing named after him out at the Whitten Oval. Fantastic stuff. Games record holder. I'm very privileged to be a good mate of Doug Hawkins. I've been a football reporter out in the western suburbs for about the last 15 years at the Western Times and currently at the Footscray Mail, and I've got to know Doug very, very well over the years. Tremendous player, number 7, was named vice-captain in the club's team of the century and also named on the wing, and just a real good Braybrook boy from the word go. Very, very proud of his roots. Talking about Braybrook, the great Mr. Football, the late and great Mr. Football, and wasn't it an emotion-charged time for football supporters in general with the passing of Whitten back in 1995? And this was a headline at the front of the newsagents, which I was lucky enough to pick up. Farewell to a hero, and the late and great Mr. Football certainly was a hero to many, many football supporters, particularly those with red, white and blue running through their veins.
Eddie Perdricet had little choice. His family were devoted fans of the old dark navy blues, and he sustained that passion.
I'm with Eddie Perdricet, who's a Carlton fan, and he's got a fantastic collection which centres around autographs, Eddie, but you've got a lot of other interesting material of letters and other associated signed memorabilia. How did you get started in collecting?
Well, basically my father was always telling me about the history of the Carlton Football Club, who he barracked for as a child, and I became interested in Carlton, barracked for them all my life, and then really started to delve into the history. And it wasn't until my father started contacting old players and they started arriving on our doorstep at home, and I would get to meet these famous premiership Carlton players such as Mocker Johnson and Gordon Mackey, and I'd have Ron Cooper's scrapbook in the lounge room to look at. And
one of the most famous was Soapy Valance, who I understand was a good friend of your father's.
Yes, they actually goes back to when Soapy worked on the farms around country Victoria on the thrashing machines, and Dad actually knew him as a child, and contacted him, and they started talking about old times, and yeah, they kept in good touch. And Soapy actually told him a story of the way he would strengthen his legs for football was when he finished to have lunch off the machine, he would go and kick a bale of hay, only about 5 metres, but if you ever lift a bale of hay, you know how heavy it is, and that's how he used to strengthen his legs to kick in his VFL career.
So Soapy was the first autograph you collected?
Yeah, basically one of the first, and really it was just one that really meant a lot to me, because my dad was actually, unfortunately, after Soapy died, but for while he was alive we never thought to ask him to sign anything. And after he died I went down to see his wife. The only signature that she had was actually on an old driver's licence, which she was kind enough to actually cut off. It's a bit tattered and torn, but to me that's just a priceless piece of Soapy Valance, who was just a grateful forward for Carlton and famous number 22. And
being a handyman, you've turned your collecting of signatures into an art form, because I understand all the framing and the mounting that began with this frame and has now progressed to quite elaborate lengths is all done by your own hand.
Yes, well, I could reframe that one again, because actually it's not the best.
You've got to start somewhere.
From my standards, but because it was one of the first I did, that's why I keep it in its original form. And yeah, that signature and the number 22, ever since then, it's meant a lot to me.
Eddie, one of the more interesting facets of your collection is, I think, that you haven't just concentrated on the signature on its own, on a scrap of paper. You've got some fantastic correspondence, and we're not far away from Anzac Day just past, and you've got some interesting letters from World War II from Carlton players. Do you want to talk about those? Yes,
these, I've picked out the more famous players. These come from the Harry Bell collection, who was a player in the 20s. I think he played just over 50 games with Carlton.
And was secretary for quite a long time.
Yeah, secretary for 11 years. And his son was kind enough to part with these to my father, and he's obviously given them to me. And when I first got them, I was originally just looking for the signatures to maybe frame the signatures up. And then I started reading the letters, and I realised I had quite a unique part of VFL history through a really turbulent time for the league. And these letters, some of the things the players have to say are just quite amazing.
It's not unusual for this sort of material to be overlooked, and in historical terms it's much more vitally important quite often than any number of signed footballs or jumpers. Are there any letters in there that you found particularly interesting?
Yes, the first one here from Jack Howell, who Chuka Howell, a ruckman. He basically is saying he received an annual report of Carlton, and he's just writing to the club to let them know how proud he is to be a Carlton player and affiliated with the club, as they can put out such an elaborate annual report in times of turbulence. And it's just, the whole thing through all these letters is how proud these players were to being a part of that club, and how much they missed playing with the club and seeing their mates who were still playing with the club. Another one here that caught my eye was from Don McIntyre, who actually, the secretary on this occasion was asked to rearrange all Don McIntyre's financial affairs, to put money in this account and to put money in that account, and giving him power of attorney, etc, etc. And a piece here that really moved me this morning when I was reading them. I've recently moved on further, but before leaving my last location I saw Jim Knight, who was eagerly awaiting his final operational flight. Unfortunately, I recently read that he was killed when the engines cut out on takeoff. Now, Jim Knight was one of 3 players from Carlton who died in the war, and I thought that was quite unique that he had actually seen him and he was preparing for his last takeoff.
Very important part of our history. Eddie, you've also got some other Soapy Valance memorabilia.
Yes, this is a later signature that I've picked up just from swap meets and things around the traps. When I see a Soapy Valance, whether I pay too much or too little, it always means a lot to me, so I pick it up whenever I can. And as you can see, I've gone a bit more elaborate with the framing this time.
And your skills have improved, guys.
Yes, a little bit. But yeah, I think that sort of sets the scene. Nice sepia photograph, the famous shot of him kicking the goal. I think it might have been in the 38, actually. I also have here, which his daughter was kind enough to give to my father after Soapy passed on, his Victorian cufflinks, which I'm not too sure how he came about them, but they're on the back of them. If you were to take them out of the case, they've been engraved Harry Valance, and they're a really nice piece for me personally to collect. And also I was able to get his Carlton Social Club medallion from a premiership year, which makes it even more special to me.
Soapy was famous for wearing number 22, and I noticed this jumper has 22 on it, but it can't have been Soapy's. I don't think Avco were the sponsor when he was playing.
No, they weren't. A long time ago my father obtained a lot of scrapbooks from previous players and took them up to Ian Collins's office to show them at the Carlton Football Club, and it was quite a funny story. When I came, I think they just got me out of the way and put me in John Elliott's office, and I was sitting in there just twiddling my thumb, so I went for a walk and I come down the hallway to see Ian Collins sitting cross-legged on the floor with my father going through old scrapbooks, which was quite funny because Ian Collins was quite a powerful man at the Carlton Football Club at the time. And he asked me who my favourite player was, and funnily enough it was the fast-leading full forward, Warren Ralph, and whether the Carlton people thought he was a good player or not, to me he wore number 22 and he kicked the goals, so that's why I liked him and that's why I chose his jumper. And even when I was a junior footballer I always wore number 22 because my dad liked to see his son running around in the famous Soapy Valance number.
Cricket, of course, has a great tradition for autographed team photographs. Unfortunately, not so many survive from Australian football, but you have a really interesting example here of the 1940 Carlton team.
It's just a nice piece. Like, it comes in a nice satchel. You can tell it's from 1940 and we finished 5th that year. But once again, I'm not sure whether it was given out to the players at the end of the season or at the start of the season, but once again, it sort of conveys to me the mateship that was involved in football in that era, and it's sort of like a school yearbook where you get everyone to sign your photo, and you know,
this is signed by most of the players, but not all of them.
No, not all of them. There's some famous names on it, but there's also some famous names not on it. Ones that are on it: Jack Rout, famous player; Jim Francis, who was captain and later coach; Jim Park, who was the other player who unfortunately died in World War II. They've signed it, and one player that hasn't signed it is Bob Chitty, and I have his signature here on a membership ticket. A lot of people I know collect membership tickets passionately, and my wife and my bank balance probably thank me for not, but when I see a rare one that actually belonged to a player, it's very nice to have. And this one actually was a life membership ticket from '62 that belonged to Bob Chitty and was signed by him as well. I think it was Jack Dyer who said he was the most dangerous and violent man he's ever played against. And I think he was the first footballer that went into movie making too.
That's a big statement coming from Jack.
Yes. I think he went on to play Ned Kelly in a movie as well. And also this one is from Jim Francis, who was in that photograph as the captain, and that's his membership ticket from 1992.
Of course, Eddie, in the era from which you collected most of your signatures, it's unusual to find signatures in ink because, of course, biros hadn't been invented. But you have got some very interesting official documents with signatures on them.
Yes, well, this one's actually a discharge certificate from the Australian Military Forces, and it's for Alec Duncan, who was a famous centre-half forward come centre-half back of the Carlton Football Club, and he's actually signed it down the bottom, which makes it even more valuable. And he's famous for partaking in the match called Duncan's Match, which was against Collingwood, where he reportedly took 33 marks in one game, was cheered off by the Collingwood supporters, which wouldn't have happened too many times, and was actually presented with the game ball for such a magnificent display of aerial marking.
And of course the other way to get signatures of old-time players in ink is to catch them somewhere late in life when biros have been invented. And this is a great team photograph of the 1938 Premiership side. Tell us about how you got those signatures.
Well, this is arguably the most important premiership to the Carlton Football Club, as they had a reputation of being good throughout the year then failing in finals, and they finally broke through in the 38 premiership. And 60 years down the track, my father decided to track down the surviving players from that team and sent this photo with the border up to them, and they all signed it for him, the players. And actually Arthur Sanger signed this piece shortly before he passed on, so not too many people would have a collection of signatures from that team 60 years down the track.
Eddie, in looking around I noticed this trophy, which intrigues me because I've never seen one before. Can you tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, so when I was playing football as a junior, this was the equivalent to the Brownlow medal, which I was lucky enough to win through sheer untouchable talent and flamboyancy, I might add. So I was just wondering what a value might be on this.
Well, that's tough. We've sold Brownlow medals for up to $80,000, but this one's got me stumped. But I'm sure it's going to be pretty valuable to your family in years to come.
Lovely. Thank you.
You can be born with it, inherit it, or develop a taste for it. This is a hobby that can turn from habit to obsession, and each of our special guests fit the bill. They're typical of the collectors.